Thank you so very much. What a blessing to be here. Skidmore College, Saratoga Springs. Oh, I want to thank my very, very dear brother for those very kind and generous words and all the precious memories come back. I just want to say to you in public that you are an intellectual gem and a moral jewel, and Skidmore College is blessed to have you in its midst. Professor Winston Grady Willis. Appreciate it. Appreciate it, brother. Appreciate it. Appreciate it indeed. I want to, of course, acknowledge the captain of the ship, the interim president, my new friend, and Sister President Susan Kress. Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. Indeed. Salute your husband sitting right next to you as well. I was blessed to meet a magnificent group of persons in human resources, and I think I have a distant cousin named Mike West. Give Vice President Mike West a hand. Give him a hand. Give him a hand. I love that last name. Love that last name, my brother. Very much so. I want to acknowledge Professor Mary C. Lynn for her magisterial history of this grand institution. I don't know whether she's here or not, but if she is, just raise your hand. If she's not, I send my love and respect, because I got a chance to look at that. Make no small plans. Well, I discovered that pioneering figure, that visionary, courageous figure, Lucy Skidmore Scribner. Yeah, she was wise enough to marry a Princeton man. Oh, John Blair, the son of Charles. Charles himself, one of the towering figures in history of publishing in this nation. But I do want to acknowledge her as well in those wonderful words that she conveyed to me. I want to also acknowledge Professor Robert Boyers and Sister Boyers and all of those who work with Samagundi magazine. It is a towering intellectual voice or set of voices, been around since 1969. I have been a religious and regular reader of that high-quality journal. Let us give Professor Boyers and others a hand. Very much so. And Professor Jennifer Delton and Professor Michelle Ray, I can't believe that it's been 20 years and 15 years. It's just amazing. Time for me as a taker and time for you as a gift. It's a beautiful thing to see you all both now here at this grand institution. And for me, of course, teaching has always been not just a noble calling, but a fundamental part of my own attempt to bear witness, to try to keep alive a tradition, as it were, that was bequeathed to me, and I try to bequeath that same tradition to the young minds who come along. I'm told as well that Lilia Bundles is in the house. If not here, then one of the other spaces. I want to acknowledge her. She was my classmate at Harvard. She's a distinguished writer in her own right, and you all know Madam C.J. Walker. She is the granddaughter. Let's give her a hand. Give her a hand as well. I'm sure many of you know my dear brother Manny Marable passed on Friday. We worked together for 30 years. He was a towering figure. He was a radical intellectual, a radical democratic intellectual. He was a freedom fighter. He worked in the grand legacy of W.B. Du Bois and Sinclair Drake against the backdrop of Marx and Weber and Zimmel and Lukács. We shall never forget him. And last but by no means least, it is true that even given the precious and priceless students here at Skidmore, that I actually here because of two very, very special sisters. They're very special sisters because I'm blessed to work for 9 years with one sister and was blessed to meet another today with Brother Doug and Brother Alex, blessed husband and son. But Mary Ann and Ted Terry had a mother who I'd like to dedicate this lecture to. She passed about a year and a half ago. On Tuesday, she would have been 73 years old, April the 12th. Her name was Carol Mariani. She exemplified levels of deep love, integrity, what it really means to dedicate one's life to two precious daughters. And I want both daughters to stand and give them a hand with the legacy of Carol Mariani, which absolutely. Long live the legacy of Carol Mariani and Terry and Marianne. As you all can see, I'm in no rush tonight. I don't know when I get a chance to come back to Skidmore. Most importantly, I'm here to learn and listen. But initially, I want to say something that unsettles you. I want to say something that unnerves you, maybe even for an instant unhouses you. I was blessed to see Brother Bishop Arnold Bird when I entered the hotel today, and just looking in his eyes, I could see the tradition that has shaped me. And it is a profoundly Socratic, prophetic, and tragic comic blues-like tradition. So I want to begin on a Socratic note. Line 38A of Plato's Apology. The unexamined life is not worth living. I could hear Brother Malcolm X whispering in the background, the examined life is painful, very painful. What are the conditions under which we muster the courage to think critically, to think deeply and compassionately, empathetically? It's very difficult in these times to wrestle with deep questions that take us outside of ourselves with this cultural superficial spectacle that generates these weapons of mass distraction. The Greek actually says the unexamined life is not a life for the human. The human. You can't talk about race and democracy. In the age of Obama, the age of Johnson, the age of Lincoln, the age of Roosevelt, and I hope not in the age of Palin. Without wrestling with the question of what does it mean to be human. I think of paragraph 12 of the great Vico's New Science, where he reminds us our English word human derives from the Latin humando, which means burial. Burial. There's an intimate connection between the tombs and the graves and the dead, with wrestling with what it means to be human and generating structures of meaning and feeling that allow us to persevere through space and time. So I want to begin with this fundamental question and talking about vicious legacies of white supremacy, vicious legacies of male supremacy, vicious legacies of imperial domination, wealth inequality, homophobia, anti-Jewish hatred, anti-Arab loathing, losing sight of the humanity of the physically challenged, of the elderly, the orphan, the widow, across the board. All of these forms, species, versions of unjustified suffering and unnecessary pain, linked to structures and institutions, but also linked to individual actions and personal prejudice. We begin with this fundamental question: what does it mean to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces? That's who we are. And it's a frightening question. Most of us would rather stay on the surface and deal with stimulation and titillation or self-medication, forms of addiction, whatever it is, to allow the present to be produced over and over again, rather than expanding our hearts, minds, and souls and bringing together the three dimensions of time, the past, the present, and the future. But this question of what does it mean to be human, for me, has to do with who I am. And I know I am who I am because somebody loved me. Somebody cared for me. Somebody attended to me. Somebody cared. Somebody focused on me, targeted me. And my hunch is that's true for you. Well, no, Brother West, I'm self-made. Well, I go with George Clinton and the brother who I have an album coming out named Bootsy Collins. I begin with the funk. We all emerged in the funk, our mama's wombs. Now, if you birth yourself, stand up, testify, and I'll end the conversation. If you're that self-made all the way down, I'd like to take a look at you right now. But this American myth of being so self-made all the way down, as if there are not antecedent conditions in place before you arrived, and somehow you thinking and making the move from your mama's womb, you won't end up in the tomb, that your body will be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms one day. That's funky too. Which means what? Which means already we have a sense of intellectual humility, even though we want to muster the courage to think critically. And anytime you talk about forms of oppression or domination, beginning especially with legacies of white supremacy in America or in the USA, you have to wrestle with forms of death. And it's difficult in American civilization that oftentimes in its dominant forms is a death-dodging, death-denying, death-ducking civilization. Doesn't want to deal with the underside. Doesn't want to deal with the dust, the soil, the earth, that funky stuff. No, we oftentimes like deodorized discourses. Like, look at U.S. Constitution, no reference to the institution of slavery. You're going to end up fighting a civil war over an institution not invoked in your Constitution. Well, Brother West, that's just a tension between principle and practice. No, that's called hypocrisy and mendacity. That's called chickens coming home to roost. That's called you reap what you sow. That's called what's in the wash comes out in the rinse. Truth crushed to earth rises again. The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. Adorno says in Negative Dialectics, echoes of Hebrew scripture, he's right. He's right. Deodorized document, just like that American Hamlet, that white literary blues man born in Mississippi, born Thomas Lanier, but we know him as Tennessee Williams, a streetcar named Desire. Blanche DuBois, what is it about you? I'm living in a world of make-believe. I'm living in a house of cards. I denied history, memory, reality, and death. And I end up in a wheelchair, broken down. I hit up against a dead end, almost like those precious derelicts. Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh in Harry Hope's saloon. Empty, shallow, hollow. What's so wonderful about Skidmore College at its best? So we are going to begin with connecting any discussion about race or gender or empire or class to wrestling with what it means to be human, which takes us to the center of what the Greeks call paideia, not schooling, deep education. You don't come to Skidmore just getting access to a skill in order to get a job and live well in some vanilla suburb. No, not the students at Skidmore. You come to be unsettled and unearthed. Is that right? Don't lie. You come to learn how to die. The way the great Montaigne said it. If you really love wisdom, you want to learn how to die. To philosophize is to learn how to die. Or as even Seneca put it, we don't expect too much profundity from the Romans, vis-a-vis the Greeks or the Egyptians. But Seneca had something to say when he said, what? He or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. There's freedom in mustering the courage to think critically, and learning how to die is examining your assumptions and presuppositions, your dogmas and your doctrine. And when you give up a set of assumptions, when you give up certain dogma, that's a form of death. And that's the only way you grow, the only way you mature, the only way you develop is in dying. There's rebirth that can flow from dying, but there is no rebirth. There is no maturation. There is no development without learning how to die. So when you do graduate, most in 4 years, I hope, you can say to yourself, I am a very different person than when I entered, because when I read Toni Morrison's Beloved and I wrestled with Shakespeare's Hamlet, I couldn't deal with David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. I took it, threw it against the wall. When I listened to Monk's epistrophe, it got to me. Maybe even for a moment, and I pray this is true for each and every precious student here at Skidmore, that you leave the classroom and recognize that your worldview rests on pudding, if only for a moment. That's called education. And when you talk about race, you're talking about a deep dogma and practice in the shaping of a noble experiment in democracy, but also an ignoble experiment in empire. You have to think of both ideas at the same time, the way F. Scott Fitzgerald put it in the crack-up of 1938 in Esquire magazine. The test of a first-rate intelligence is what? To hold two opposing ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Ask our indigenous people for 1492 was the beginning of World War I. It's been going on ever since. Empire. Ask those who keep track of the heroic actions of Brother Thomas Jefferson and Brother George Washington against the British Empire. Absolutely heroic, magnificent, courageous, but slaveholders. So it's freedom and slavery. Freedom for some, enslavement for others. That 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies who were enslaved, whose very labor generated the wealth, which is a precondition of the democratic experiment, just like our precious indigenous brothers and sisters whose babies were violated, whose lands was dispossessed, as a precondition for U.S. democracy. Can we keep both ideas in our head at the same time? The noble democratic experiment and the ignoble imperial one, in which white supremacy, male supremacy class at work. And this is not PC chit-chat. 15, 20 years ago, we got discourses coming out of so many of our humanities courses saying, well, we're tired of talking about those Negroes catching hell. We're tired of talking about those women subjugated. We're tired of talking about the gay brothers and lesbian sisters. Let's just talk about colorblind discourse. Sometimes colorblind leaves us morally blind, deliberately ignorant of realities that take us to the same questions that some of our conservative brothers and sisters were preoccupied with, which is paideia, deep education, which is Socratic, absolutely, no doubt. But to be on intimate terms with forms of death provides the occasion for the kind of unleashing of Socratic action which is required for any wrestling with race and democracy. And by Socratic energy, I mean raising the most painful questions. When you look at the history of black people in America, 244 years of social death. In the language of the great Orlando Patterson, my beloved tutor at Harvard and still magisterial author and grand professor. Social death, no public status whatsoever, no social standing, just commodity to be bought and sold. 244 years, a long time. Long time. And what did black people do in response to it? He said, oh, you can victimize us, but we are never solely victims. We'll steal away at night in a ring shout in the dark because it's against the law for black people to learn how to read and write. It was against the law for black people to worship God without white supervision in the land of religious liberty. You had to go on the down low. Real late at night, hold hands and raise their voices and sing songs, a moan and groan, and those spirituals, of course, magnificent artistic expressions that the world today still is profoundly moved by and will be moved by 50 and 100 years from now, lifting their voices. That's the very anthem of black people in America. James Weldon Johnson and Rosamond Johnson are lifting their voice, and I want to remind the young people here, it's lifting your voice, not lifting your echo. Not lifting your echo. They were originals. Too many young people today, copies. They believed in creation and invention. Too many young folk, market-driven imitations. Not enough courage. William Butler Yeats is right when he says it takes more courage to examine the dark corners of their own soul than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. Can't talk about race and democracy in America in any age, let alone the age of Obama, and we're going to get to that. Unless you are courageous, not in a self-righteous way, still tied to Socrates' intellectual humility, but courageous. It's very difficult to be courageous if you're preoccupied with narrow conceptions of success. It's very difficult to be courageous if you're not willing to put yourself, your mind, heart, and soul on the line. It's very difficult to be courageous if you are fearful of being adventurous, the way in which Alfred North Whitehead talked about it in Adventures of Ideas. And by adventurous, I don't mean the social network where you have the triumph of the human spirit by generating new ideas in order to make big money and trash your girlfriend. When I looked at that movie, I said, my God, this is an exemplar of a level of spiritual malnutrition, of emptiness, shallowness, hollowness, intimately linked to moral constipation. Well, they knew what was right. It was just stuck and they couldn't get out. Too much greed, too much avarice, too much obsession with status and stature. Not wrestling with what it means to be human, but what it means to be successful. That is hegemonic among the younger generation. I didn't have that problem. I'm old school. It's true. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, Curtis Mayfield, Carole King, Stephen Sondheim. Hey! These folk not stand the fact of being treated unjustly. When you love folk, you can't stand the fact of being treated unfairly. You've got to do something about it. And if you don't do it, the rocks are going to cry out. That's Emmett Till. That's Martin King. That's Fannie Lou Hamer. That's Bob Moses. That's Curtis Mayfield. That's Nina Simone, just on the chocolate side. We've got Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel on the Jewish side. Grace Boggs on the Asian side. Host of other examples, but the same tradition. The best of Socratic questioning, the best of the spirituality of loving, promoting justice, empathizing. And I could at this moment just stop and play John Coltrane's The Love Supreme and sit down. Just sit down. That's it. Socratic to the core, prophetic to the core, talking about race and democracy. Democracy about what? Having the courage to make yourself and remake yourself connected to public interest in such a way that you find your voice. You're just not an echo bouncing against other voices, not just in the ballot box, but sometime in the streets. Thank God for Madison, Wisconsin. Thank God for Indianapolis, Indiana. Learning again democratic lessons from Africa, Cairo, Egypt. Tunisia, just like we learned in the early 90s from Nelson Mandela in South Africa. How do you stand up, question, love enough to bear witness, but still have your fallibility in place, which means you're willing to keep listening and keep learning, because everything is subject to revision. Now, in the age of Obama, where are we? Not enough Socratic energy, not enough prophetic witness. And I had to cut radically against the grain. First time I heard my dear brother Barack Obama, it was in Boston. I was in the room there with Brother Tavis Smile. I was telling Marianne just this earlier. And the brother said, America is a magical place. I turned to Brother Tavis. I said, this brother's going to have a Christopher Columbus experience. He's going to discover America. Ain't nothing magical about America. America is free and democratic, Socratic and prophetic, to the degree to which citizens muster the courage to keep it free, democratic, Socratic, and prophetic. America can go fascist? Absolutely. America can go authoritarian? Absolutely. Empires come and go in human history. The citizenry gets cowardly, fearful, manipulated by powers that be, obsessed not with the divine right of kings, but the divine right of investment bankers, the divine right of oligarchs who have been reshaping the country and the world in their image for the last 35 and 40 years as they crush the counter movements and counter voices, be they trade unions, be they poor people's movements, be they black freedom movements, co-opting their leaders. Why? Because, young folk, I want to say this to you. You live in a historical moment in which sometimes it seems as if everybody's up for sale. Just show me the highest bidder. And I'm not against money. I'm not against being paid. But if that money fundamentally determines what you say and who you are, you have already sold your soul for a mess of pottage. And you have already defined yourself as one who is well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference, no matter how successful you are. And what is distinctive about the Socratic prophetic traditions is that there's something called integrity. I didn't say perfection, I said integrity. Intellectual integrity, moral integrity, spiritual integrity if you're religious the way I am. But if you're atheistic or agnostic, brother and sister, just call it existential integrity. Same point. The kind of person you choose to be. The kind of life you choose to live. The kind of courage you choose to manifest in both dialogue and reflection and in action. And these are old truths, nothing new at all. But we're in the process of losing it even in the age of Obama. And I supported Barack Obama. I did 65 events for my dear brother from Iowa to Ohio. I told him at the very beginning, I said, I'm going to be a Socratic and prophetic supporter. He said, what is that? I said, I'm going to speak the truth as I understand it, and I want to bring the age of Reagan to a close. And I include Clinton within the age of Reagan. It was Clinton who deregulated derivatives, thanks to Brother Larry Summers and company. Love that, brother. It was Clinton who signed a welfare bill that Reagan wouldn't sign to triangulate the Republicans and steal that thunder. It was Clinton who signed the crime bill with mandatory sentences that promoted the escalation of the prison industrial complex. And yet the same black folk, same progressive/liberals, still supporting him as he plays his saxophone. I say, put it down. We got John Coltrane, brother. We need some progressive policy here. So the age of Reagan cuts across Democrats and Republicans. It actually began with Carter deregulating in the 70s. So one hoped that Barack Obama would serve as a counterweight. And in the Democratic rhetoric during the campaign, it looked as if he would. He invoked Martin King over and over and over again. And you say, don't deodorize Martin. He didn't use the word colorblind. He wanted us to be love-struck. He died fighting for sanitation workers. He died because he loved Vietnamese babies. He was against the U.S. occupation in Vietnam. That's Martin. When he died, 72% of Americans against him. 55% of black people against him. He stood alone. Socratic, prophetic. But he was mobilized during the campaign. So, but wait a minute. How are you going to build on this legacy? And the rhetoric was, in fact, quite reassuring to many of us. But as soon as he won, in those cathartic moments, many of us, if not all of us, will never forget. He brought in those connected to the Wall Street oligarchs, the Tim Geithners and Summers and others. He brought in those tied to the old foreign policies in the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, the old Washington consensus, the neoliberal preoccupation with interests as we ally ourselves with thugs and gangsters like Mubarak and others. The hope began to fade. And at this point, with William Daley, at this point, not mentioning poverty one time in the State of the Union, the first time a president didn't mention poverty since 1948. Obsessed with the next election rather than the next generation in any serious way. Allowing the conservatives to define the terrain so that it's all about budget deficits rather than trying to generate conditions under which jobs can be available to persons who are wrestling with levels of unemployment and underemployment, working people dealing with foreclosing of homes and education being decrepit, and you get crumbs of $4 billion with a race to the top as this education is a race and not a right. And the vicious attacks on the teachers' unions, but Finland is #1 in education in the world, and 90% of their teachers are unionized, so that maybe something else is going on. Well, when you hold for poverty in America, for well-to-do children in America are #1 in science and math, just like Finland, because they have similar conditions of high-quality schools, small classrooms, teachers who care, parents are involved, and they are told every week, you are brilliant, whether it's true or not. Self-confidence, self-respect. When you introduce poverty, that's when America begins to slide down the list. And no serious talk about poverty escalating now in the last 2.5 years under my dear brother Barack Obama. I'm not even talking about the 110 drones dropped in Pakistan this last year. Bush had 45 drones dropped in 8 years. Obama had 53 the first year. Trying to kill terrorists, okay, but not their children, not their grandchildren. What distinguishes a democratic regime is that you have rule of law, not collective punishment. That even the terrorist grandchild has sanctity and dignity. We don't have a right to kill a terrorist grandchild. Just like Emmett Till did not have the right to say, we're going to drop a bomb on the white folk in the neighborhood who know who killed my child, who they hanging out with. No, justice, not revenge. Where are we now? We're in deep trouble in the age of Obama in trying to talk about democracy, especially as it relates to race. Dear brother Mike Dyson says Barack Obama's been running from race the way a black man runs from the police. That's just graphic and provocative, but the point is he knows that if he's obsessed with the next election, it's the white independents and the moderates you speak to. So as that prison-industrial complex intensifies and the poverty intensifies, just last week, Unemployment, decline. Black unemployment, increase. No reference to it whatsoever. Why? Doesn't help in the election. Well, you know what? We're not just concerned about the election. We want to know the truth and what you're doing about the truth and the suffering. And how are we going to come to terms with that suffering, given the fact that we got a right-wing Republican Party and a centrist right-wing Democratic Party, and who will speak for working people, middle-class folk who once thought they were middle class, they were workers with a bourgeois identity. Once they lost their jobs, they become part of the new poor. That's where we are. That is the tradition that, for me, is worth living and dying for. And you all have been very patient. I've started with a Socratic note. I want to end on a blue note, because we really are talking about a blues-like situation. You know, the great Ralph Ellison used to say the blues ain't nothing but a autobiographical chronicle of a personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. So it's a lyrical response to the catastrophic. You know, B.B. King says, nobody loves me but my mom, and she might be jiving too. That's the blues. It's like Sophocles' Antigone, live in the tomb, all of the forces in the universe against you, but what do? Keep smiling. You might need a little help with Lucille, but you're still smiling, because you come out of a tradition that has taught you the Socratic energy and prophetic witness. Even when it looks like it's waning, it's worth remembering, like that 9th thesis of Walter Benjamin's thesis on history. You remember in order to sustain your resilience and your resistance with moral integrity, spiritual integrity, but a willingness to sacrifice and finding joy in serving the least of these. Those Frantz Fanon call the wretched of the earth. That's a life choice. And you can't do it unless you have a tragic comic sensibility, knowing that failure is always already built in, the way Beckett talks about it. Try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. And I know when they put me in the grave, just call me a failure who had a good time struggling with Socratic questioning, prophetic witness, because the suffering will still be here, but I will be so used up in the coffin that every fiber of who I am would have been exerted just to keep that tradition alive, but knowing no one of us are messiahs. We're not going to save the world or save America or save ourselves. We're just trying to leave it a little better than we found it by building on these great traditions, the best of the legacies of Athens and Jerusalem, and at the same time saying we are going to deal with the most painful questions, those that most or too many people would rather sweep under the rug. Do we have what it takes? That's an open question. And it's like the conclusion of a practical Aristotelian syllogism. It's not a proposition. It's an action. It's a way of life. It's a mode of being in the world. That you attempt to become more Socratic, more prophetic, more blues-like, so you're a long-distance runner. Be able to pick up that baton from Martin Luther King and the others. That's what we need in this generation. Do we have what it takes? We shall see. I am in no way optimistic, because the blues had nothing to do with optimism. The blues have been down so long, down, don't worry me no more. That's why I keep keeping on. That's not optimistic. But if you're a blues-like intellectual freedom fighter, you're a prisoner of hope. And never confuse hope with optimism. The audacity of hope has nothing or little to do with cheap optimism in some truncated conception of an American dream. It comes out of a long tradition of a peoples in the face of the catastrophic, who, like Emmett Till's mother, can still raise questions, can still tell the truth, expose lies, bear witness, die with dignity, and pass it on to the next generation. And I can simply say this to each and every one of you all, that I'm going down swinging like Muhammad Ali and Ella Fitzgerald for this Socratic, prophetic, and tragic comic tradition we call democracy at its best. Thank you all so very much. God bless. God bless. Thank you all so very much. You've been very patient with me. Thank you so very much. You've been very patient. You've been very patient. You've been very patient. Very patient. I like your fro. Like your fro there, brother. Thank you so very much. You're so patient. We have good time for questions. Thank you so very much. Definitely. Indeed, you're so patient. We'll have good time for question and answer because this is such a beautiful part of the country here. You still got snow up here, though, isn't that something? Woo. Tell Brother Doug, I see you got snow in the backyard, too. Oh, Sister Terry, Brother Alex. Questions, please don't hesitate. Don't hesitate. I see a hand here. Do we, we might not have, do we have a microphone? Maybe we don't have a microphone. Just belt it out. Where's the hand? Yeah, just stand right up, though, brother. But belt it out so we can all hear. And I'll repeat it for those in other rooms. You've got to be connected with persons who have already made that kind of claim on their lives, so you'll be encouraged by those who are not thinking like you, but have the quality of commitment to deep questioning, a quality of commitment to a certain kind of witness that flows out of love to justice, that accents the plight of those below, and to, in some way, always be part of a network, an organization, part of some kind of organizing and mobilizing. Now, for example, the students, it's very important that you always have certain kinds of discussion groups. Exactly. Exactly. Sometimes you just got to let it out, you know. Discussion groups. I think it's very important that there's always a town-gown connection. So we have students going to the prison, students mentoring our precious young folk of any color, but especially our poor and working class young folk, so that you get in the lives of those folk. The last thing we need is to have young people saying they're mentors on television. Who's your mentor? Oh, for Winfrey. No, she don't know you. She could be your inspiration. She's an entrepreneurial genius. She doesn't have a whole lot of political courage, but, you know, you can't have everything. But you can be inspired by her. But a mentor, you get young folk from Skidmore connected to those younger folk. You can talk to them, touch them, wrestle with their questions. Talk about why, in fact, they're feeling so lonely and isolated, and let them know they are not in the world alone. Here, read some Chekhov. You really want to wrestle with loneliness. You really want to wrestle with perseverance. If only we knew at the end of the greatest play, the 20th century, The Three Sisters. You really want to wrestle with what it means to be marginalized and feeling as if your yearnings have the chance of a snowball in hell. That describes a lot of young folk these days. Chekhov's got something to say. He's got a whole lot to say. You see, he's the blues man par excellence. But he's not American, so unlike Eugene O'Neill and unlike Tennessee Williams, he has no romantic backdrop. So he has no high expectations to be shattered. So he's not tempted by the bug of cynicism, which is the flip side of sentimentalism. There's no sentimentality or cynicism in Chekhov. It's just the truth, as I understand it, but I think he's right. But I mean, that's a larger... That's a larger issue. So you got to take a stand somewhere on this thing. But do you see my point? Connected. Connective. We saw allusions to recent incidents here in town and so forth and so on. Open the dialogue up. When you open it up, it's going to be painful. You're going to be surprised. Oh, my God, I didn't know people thought that. Oh, my God, these persons are actually supportive. I didn't realize this person who didn't speak that much actually is supportive. I didn't realize this person who didn't speak that much really believe what they believe. People have a right to their beliefs. People have a right to be wrong. We have to be libertarians about this. Our conversation has to be mediated with respect and civility, but still honest. It's the only way you get it out. That's what the Socratic energy is. That requires candor and courage. and openness and a willingness to be wounded in the conversation, you see. And then in other contexts, you know, you're able to be even more politically active, especially when it comes to civil disobedience, for example. I'm a deep believer in civil disobedience. I think Thoreau is right. I think that Gandhi is right. I think Martin's right. I've had some magnificent nights in jail. Magnificent. But I bring my check off. Oh, yes. Yes, dear brother. The anonymity, absolutely. Very much so. Very much so. Look at Thomas Pynchon. Nobody's seen him in 45 years. I mean, like his wife and kid, I'm sure, got a glimpse. But he just so, he hates the culture of celebrity. You know, he read Nathaniel West. He knows that fame is a very cold and hard thing. So unlike Norman Mailer, he stays away from TV. God bless the late, great Norman Mailer. It was a different response, you see. Then there's a sense of not even having your name on a text, which is even more radical. Now, Thomas Pynchon does put his name on there, which I'm glad he does, because we need some sense of who this great writer is. Should have won a Nobel Prize a long time ago. But yes, very much so. Now, did you have another question behind the question, or? Yeah, you can follow up there, brother. Oh, you all right? No, because you feel. Yes. Oh, I see. Oh, I see. Yes. Lord. See, I've never had a computer, so I don't really know what this dynamic is. Thank God for Mary Ann. No, but that's a little different context there, because their anonymity has to do with persons who are being mean and cold-hearted and ugly in their behavior, and not wanting to take responsibility. I think that is a very different. I think people have a right to it, but people have a right to be cowardly. I said I'm a libertarian about this. We have a right to tell them this is cowardly, and you ought to step forward. You see, in a debate, in a public forum, and so forth, and tell them we will protect your rights in terms of you not being viciously attacked and disrespected and so forth. But we want to have a public conversation. I see what you're talking about. There's not a lot of these, though, is there? We're just talking about a few. More than there should be. Yeah, more than there should be. But you see, I think the internet actually tends to facilitate that kind of cowardice. But it's another sign, again, how as important as science and technology really are, that when you talk about paideia, you're talking about the people who are who they are and bring what they bring to the internet. So you can never fetishize science and technology and ascribe magical powers to it. It could be used for ill. It could be used for good. Definitely. But I'm so glad you all raised this issue in terms of how you get at folk who are not responsible enough and courageous enough to say, this is my view. You see. Question? Yes. Resistance. Yes. Yeah. He said what? He said what? You going to ask the same question? You all on the same vibe, huh? Yes, indeed, indeed. How do you address resistance? How do you approach it? Well, of course, it depends on the context. It depends on, when we talk about Socratic questioning, it goes hand in hand with trying to cultivate phronesis, or practical wisdom, so you have judgments relative to what the context actually is and what the various options are. You see, certain moments, certain options are more desirable than other kinds of options, and it's changing all the time. You see, but there are circumstances under which the last resort is just massive mobilization of the street. Very much so. I mean, for me, the kind of holy anger and righteous indignation I have when it comes to poor people's situation being thoroughly overlooked in this nation and around the world, you see, that any possibility of massive mobilization that can be effective, for the most part nonviolent, that would have impact, I support across the board. Because in a certain sense, it's just a last resort. Now, you're talking about resistance in the context of Skidmore College? Yeah, yeah. There, I think both the dialogue, trying to hunt down those persons who have countervailing views, argue the views, and then bring in the administrators, bring in the professors, and bring in the staff. There's a lot of wisdom in the staff that colleges and universities overlook, you know. And I do salute the faculty. Faculties are at the center of things, the librarians. But staff has something to say, because staff is actually dealing with similar realities, but their contexts oftentimes are marginalized in an academic context where the focus is rightly so on young people. So you need to have a community-wide conversation and then bring in those from the community who've been wrestling with these issues. But there's no way that I could dictate particular kinds of strategies and tactics being outside of this particular context at the moment. But I know at Princeton, I mean, I moved from dialogue with the president and dialogue with deans and so forth, bringing students and others together, to bringing in community folk. Mm-hmm. Well, the power is always asymmetric. The powerful and the less powerful. That's a given. You know, so that's part of the elements that have to be considered in your practical judgments that you make. Oh, absolutely. Because you know it's not a level playing field. Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. And that's fascinating when you think of even a black president in the White House, unprecedented, magnificent on the symbolic level. And yet you say to yourself, I mean, to what degree does he have to be fearful of becoming a black mascot of Wall Street oligarchs so that he's not really in the driver's seat? You see, where the Oval Office itself becomes a golden cage and a sunlit prison because so many of the interests bombarding him. Right? What is it? What do they say now? For every congressman, they got 23 lobbyists? I mean, that's the level of corruption in terms of the penetration of big money in the forms of legalized bribery that Russell Feingold talked about for years and just lost his seat in Wisconsin, you see. And at the level of the executive order, he's got it coming at him too. And so at that point, you say to yourself, wait a minute. Asymmetric relations of power is a very complicated thing. And this is something that so many black folk are wrestling with. You know, the first time black people ever got together, the public convention was Philadelphia, 1837. And Henry Highland Garnett got up and said, never confuse the situation of black people with that of the Israelites in Hebrew scripture. For black people, Pharaoh was on both sides of the bloody Red Seas. People say, what that brother talking about? We're trying to be free. I see. Slavery, break the back of it, 12 years, multiracial democracy. Here comes Jim Crow. Jim Crow, break the back of it, move up to the city, Jim Crow Jr. waiting for you. Residential segregation, school segregation. Schools are more racially segregated now than they were 40 years ago. And yet the law says something else, you see. Black president, black poverty rates increasing, black prison population increasing. Now, for some successful middle-class black folk, they're breakdancing daily because they're getting recognition, they get assets, they sipping tea in the White House. But Jamal and Letitia and Ray Ray and Jaquila catching hell. Catching hell. And the tradition of Martin is what? You start with them first. So that Obama is celebrated, but it's so misleading. What does the Nobel Peace Prize Committee say? He's the fulfillment of King's dream. That's a lie. He's a fulfillment of King's dream. He's not the fulfillment of King's dream. And as long as there's folks suffering, not just black people, but brown and yellow and red and white across the board. Martin's dream is deferred. But it's so easy these days to fall into this notion of what I'm talking about, the kind of defanging of serious forms of resistance. So people say, oh, Brother West, you just stuck in the 60s. No, I'm not stuck in the 60s. I'm stuck in the struggle for justice in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. This century, if you hear me 150 years from now, I'm still going. Biology's kicked in. Technology's helped me out. Same message. Same message. But the message is old. It goes all the way back to Athens, Jerusalem, and so forth. It's an old message. It's not new here at all. Not at all, but circumstances are very different. I'm going to be much shorter in my answers here. Yes, my dear brother, right there. Just stand. Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Wonderful question. Now, I don't want to claim that Republicans are and by Republicans, I'm talking about the dominant tendencies, because a lot of Republicans aren't subsumable under the dominant tendency, but most are tilted in a certain direction. And I don't want to claim that Republicans and the Democrats are identical, because there's a difference between mean-spirited and milquetoast. That's not an identity claim, but it's not a compliment for either. So that there's still a difference. It's just the Democrats know that their social base is one in which they have to give lip service to concern about working people. Right? Now, let's think, for example, one of the most important things that can be done for working people right now is for the Employment Free Choice Act to pass so that they have a right to engage in sustained collective bargaining and not have to deal with the harassment of their bosses. It's been sitting on the table for 2.5 years. You see, 2.5 years. Not just public unions, but private unions, you see. So the Democrats' lip service, oh, we're concerned about black youth, then why don't you sign the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Act? It hasn't been reauthorized in 4 years. It's one of the few things standing between young brothers and sisters who are poor, disproportionately of color, and the juvenile delinquent system, which is the ladder to the prisons, remains on the desk. What's going on? These are Democrats we're talking about, you see. So what do? Well, first thing you have to do is let the Democrats know you can't be taken for granted. Let the Democrats know that your commitment to truth, not naive, but authentic, to the best of your fallible ability, is deeper than simply their addiction to power. That there's something called a commitment to truth and justice that's not reducible to Machiavellian calculations and political machinations in terms of the next election. And unfortunately, those who talk in this way feel as if the only thing they can do is support the Democratic Party. I refuse to believe that. I think we got to be more jazz-like. We can be inside and outside, sometimes more outside than inside, but moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Right now, we don't have enough on the outside, and it's partly because those who would have been on the outside were incorporated within the Obama campaign, and then that then became linked to the Democratic National Committee, and a lot of that energy was siphoned off into the Democratic National Committee with the neoliberal policies. And that actually provided the occasion for the kind of populist movement that the Tea Party represents, the conservative populist movement, where they talk about feeling powerless. I understand that. They talk about corrupt government. I understand that. They claim that they want a smaller government, but that's not really true, because when it comes to military-industrial complex, they don't really want to touch it. And they're being bankrolled by the very Wall Street oligarchs and corporate plutocrats who they claim they're against. You see. So all of a sudden you say, this is not the kind of progressive democratic populism one has in mind. This is a deeply conservative form of populism. But they're speaking out of genuine pain, of feeling left out, and feeling that somehow their voices don't count. But that's true for many of us. We just move in a different direction. So that for me right now, it's up in the air in terms of which particular kind of strategies we use. Right now, I'm in the process of putting very, very strong pressure on the Obama administration and in Congress. People like Bernie Sanders, of course, who I respect deeply, and he sounds very similar to me. I sound very similar to him. Vermont, holding out for dear life, you know. But we need more Bernie Sanders-like figures inside the system and outside of the system, and especially among the younger generations, but in your own voice. Right? Don't imitate me. Oh, don't emulate me at all. I said I'm old school. It's like Lil Wayne trying to sound like the last poets. He can't do it. Tattoos and all, he can't do it. I wish he had more last poet content, even though the song on Katrina is serious. But Lollipop, you know, it's just not my thing. No, I'm in the Paideia. We need more than that. Question in the back. Oh, maybe we should, was it up? Any questions? Yeah, this brother right here. Oh, you got to do it. You just have to do it. Very much like learning how to ski. You got to ski. Don't read the book. Ski. You got to do it. Like learn how to love. Don't read a novel on love. Take a leap. You got to do it. Which say creating context for it. And by context, I don't mean mass things. I'm talking about small context with friends or people who you don't know. See, don't downplay what you think is little or smallness. Smallness matters. Littleness matters, you see. Because, for example, you'll never have a movement without bonds of trust. Without bonds of trust. Well, all bonds of trust require militants for tenderness. Because when you're tender, people are more likely to be open and more likely to be vulnerable, which generates possibility of political intimacy, personal intimacy, and that's what holds groups together. That's what holds movements together. You see? So don't downplay the little group. Well, I'll call a meeting and only 7 people showed up. That's better than 6. That's better than 5. Now, what is the quality of the 7? Back to resistance. But these days, everybody wants big numbers, like these mega churches think they're doing something because they got a mega church. Well, how much mega courage you got in your mega church? How much mega justice you got in your... Well, I hadn't thought about that. We got a big building fund. I'm not impressed. Not impressed. It's just spectacle. Just spectacle. What's the real substance and content? That's the question. And I know you all already have these kinds of networks, and I hope they grow here at Skidmore and Princeton and other places. Are there any questions way up top? Yes. You talked a lot about colors tonight, and I appreciate all that as a prism. Yes. You should pass that to us. I need to hear more about green, that is capitalism, and integrity in the economic system. You talk about integrity in the economic system. How can we be more part of that? Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question, though, brother. One is because I think, when I was talking about releasing Socratic energy, one would be an analysis, the kind of subtle analysis one certainly doesn't have time for in 50 minutes or so, of how present-day tendencies in global capitalism, with the monopolies and oligopolies and so forth, supposedly generating more competition, but more of the smaller enterprises being devoured by the bigger enterprises, themselves make it more and more difficult for them to be accountable to people or nation states. That truth needs to be widely known and widely circulated. Now, how does that relate to green? Well, if you're looking at nature in an I-it disposition rather than an I-thou, it's simply there to be dominated, conquered for short-term gain, to squeeze out all you can squeeze. The question then becomes, what kind of counter-analysis, counter-movement do we have? Who makes those truths more widely circulated? Now, that raises a question about the role of the corporate/entertainment media. Because these days, much of the media is driven not just by market ends and aims, but mediated with entertainment enactments. Because people have very short attention spans. Very short. So you have to be able to, like Horace, delight and instruct as you entertain, to keep people's attention. That's one of the reasons why in our day, some of the most effective critics are those who exercise that kind of parrhesia. In line 24a in Plato's Apology, Socrates said, "Parrhesia was the cause of my unpopularity." That means a fearless speech, unintimidated speech. And where do we find that today in our market-driven society? On television. It's the comics. You see, it's Jon Stewart. It's Bill Maher. Who's the others? Stephen Colbert. You see. Or you go to a Chris Rock concert and just listen to that brother speak some truths that very few so-called black leaders speak. When you think back of Richard Pryor, you think back of Lenny Bruce. It goes all the way back to Lucian and Aristophanes. But these days, it's going to be those persons who raise these issues that widely circulated, but they have to be connected with, of course, the scholars and intellectuals who are writing these texts that reveal these deep flaws and faults and relative failures of a global capitalist society, a global capitalist economy, linked to ecology, linked to issues of class subordination, how it connects to gender, how it connects to race, and so forth and so on. That's the beginning of an answer to the question. That's a very complicated question you raise, though. I appreciate that. But there was a voice way in the back. There we go. Yes, yes, yes. Don't fall over now, you all. Yeah, there you go. Yes. That's right. Yes, ooh, it's a wonderful question. Absolutely. I think the first thing is, did you hear the question? Oh, you missed out on that wonderful question. My brother, you tell me whether I'm fair to your formulation. The distinction between success and greatness, you want to be great. At the same time, you have to deal with money, and you want to be able to live a life that somehow is balanced in such a way that your success can contribute to your greatness, even as you don't allow the money to become a form of idolatry in your life, so it becomes the end-all and be-all. Is that a fair interpretation of what you're getting at? Yes, exactly. Absolutely. No, absolutely. But I think first and foremost, and I love the way you started, you want to be true to yourself. You know, you got to be Shakespearean about it. I own self be true. Night follows day, that can be false to no one. You got to be true to yourself. So if you find yourself at a particular moment where you are obsessed with success, admit it and then change. Don't try to be somebody you're not. You see, I was just at Howard this weekend. Howard University, they had a wonderful student leader conference. And the folk were, well, you know, I want to be a leader. Well, do you really want to be a leader? This is not a career. It's not a job. Don't confuse your life task with your job. Brother Martin used to say, if you want to be a leader, then get ready to put on your cemetery clothes. That's what he used to tell folk in the 60s. He's 27 years old. And you tell folk, well, I wasn't really talking about cemetery clothes. I just want to be on television. Then tell the truth. That's what you want. You want to be on somebody's show. And then learn how to grow into something deeper, right? So I love the way you started. This is where I am. I love that. So first, you're true to yourself. Then you say, I need the balance. And you say, I want to use my success to the best of my ability, taking care of my loved ones, my mother and father and grandparents and others, not being apologetic about that, and yet at the same time knowing that I really want to reach the point where I find joy in serving others. You have to have a joy and a passion about it. It's not something that you kind of hate to do but figure you should do because it's your duty. It has to be a passion. And I already detect that passion in you, my brother. So then the question becomes, what would be the context? What would be the context? It'd be an example, for example. We just had Brother Lupe Fiasco in my class. He comes every year. And, Lupe is somebody who, he's not interested in being Jay-Z. He's just not. If Laser sold 1 million copies, I mean, he's not going to complain, but he's just not as moved by that. That's the kind of brother he is. And he's a Muslim brother. He's got a deep sense of vocation. You see. Jay-Z's different. Jay-Z wants a lot of copies. So even now, Kanye the same way. You see. They're being true to themselves. You see. The question is, and the same is true, we had the public dialogue with Jay-Z when his book came out in New York Public Library. The question is, given who Jay-Z is, how can he use his success to be greater? But he has to be himself. He comes from Marcy Projects. He's a different kind of brother coming in that context. He got to be who he is. It's like asking Tyler Perry to be Spike Lee. It's not going to work. But Tyler can learn a whole lot, but he's out on the block and Spike's at Morehouse and NYU. He come out of a different situation. He's got to be true to himself, you see. But he needs to grow and mature like all of us. Now, Tyler's got more of that than Spike does, because Spike's political consciousness, Spike's level of a certain kind of, how would I put it? I mean, it's a level of certain kind of ease of moving in a mainstream that you get from living in middle-class context. That's different than growing up on the block the way Brother Tyler did. And I love both of them. I believe both of them have potential, but I want both of them to be themselves. But I can still put pressure on them by various examples. Oh, there's Malcolm Little. He's a gangster. He's a pimp. He's a thug. There's Malcolm X, courageous, visionary, still growing. Elijah loves him, transforms him. He outgrows Elijah with his love. Malcolm was true to himself in each stage. That was part of his strength. That's crucial. That's very, and this artists, I think, have a certain kind of understanding of this that professionals and managers tend to have less of, because professionals and managers are not really taught to put a premium on courage. It's just not. That's part of the problem of the academy, you see, especially in the last 40 years. The aim of the academy is what? Make sure the young person is the smartest one in the room. How spiritually empty that is. Smartness? Since when does just smartness in and of itself constitute a force for good? The Nazis had smart persons. Goebbels was very smart. He listened to Beethoven, he read Goethe, he could write great prose, but he was a gangster to the core. And I'm not anti-smart, but what I'm saying is that so much more is required. And that's very much what the lecture was about, right? It's not just cerebral overdevelopment. It's a connection of heart, mind. And what does Sister Lucy say? Mind and hand. And we would add soul. I'm sure she was a soulful sister in her own way, in her own day. Not expecting her to be Ida B. Wells Barnett, you know. Last few questions before we run. Yes, with this brother here and then the sister here. Is that all right? But stand up and just belt it out.
How does one rationally address irrational negativity or subtle hatred?
I think the question was, how does one rationally address irrational and even hatred? Yeah, I think that you always want to push to the limits what I would call critical intelligence and mature rationality. You always want to push it to the limits, but you want to be aware that the limits are real, which means you need something more than just rational arguments if you're going to touch the person's soul to get them to change. You see, first thing you want to do is you want to see what it's like to be in the shoes and skin and world of that person who's full of hate. Empathy. Empathy. You see, because every human being full of hate, in some sense, has a potential for something better. And you think of our own selves, moments in which we're full of hate, that we know that doesn't exhaust all that we are. That's in part what Emmett Till's mother, Sister Mamie, was talking about. That's what Martin King was about. That's what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Hess was about. And empathy is inseparable from imagination. You have to have the courage to imagine, get out of your own skin, even though it's in the end might be impossible. You try to. And get in a sense, why would they be attracted to something so thuggish like this? But they're still as human as you are, and I am. So you try to get inside, you see. And you say, oh, well, let me try to tease something out that would convince them that they're living a blatant contradiction. See what I mean? Oh, I can't stand black people. How old are you? 27. You never liked Prince's music? Oh, Prince's music I couldn't live with for 4 years. Well, we got a hook now. Because Prince is as black as I am. Well, no, he's not black, he's different. Oh, okay, now you got an anomalous category. So the ones you hate are over here, and the black folk you love are over here. I see, we making progress. You're not a wholesale white supremacist. You're not wholesale, you piecemeal. We making progress. You see what I mean? I'm being facetious, but, and this is true in terms of the hatred of our gay brothers and lesbian sisters. This is true for any group in this regard, you see. And this is not to say that, you're going to overcome this thing quickly, but argument plus imaginative reflection connected to empathy that somehow connects you to them, that allows you access to their world so that then you can begin to move them in a certain kind of way. That's the starting point, I think. Yes, your question.
You cited Socrates at the beginning, unexamined not worth living.
Yes.
You also stated that it's hard to convince others to practice that philosophy as well as yourself. It's hard for you to do that. So what do you recommend us doing, in regards to examining ourselves and others in regards to racial issues, the homosexuality issue, and like any class issue? How do you recommend us going about that?
Well, one, as I mentioned before, you want to make sure that there are contexts in which the voices can be raised across these various issues. So we're going to have a discussion of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. So we want to talk about homophobia. We want to talk about empire. We want to talk about white supremacy. You see. Then you have a discussion that cuts across other groups. You have a discussion with white brothers who themselves may come out of contexts in which they know class status is real, whether their parents were dealing with being subjugated by bosses or whether they have friends who are bosses. So you still have some acknowledgement of their potential to change. But there's a context for discussion, exposing lies and trying to exchange arguments and visions, and pursuing truths and so forth. But then there's also a political context where the mobilizing and the organizing has to take place. So I don't want to conflate those two. I don't want you to think that it's just about dialogue. Because when you're dealing with asymmetric relations of power, it's also about pressure. But each context has its own kind of specificity and integrity and its own role to play. Very, very much so. That's what's so wonderful about those figures who have such holistic visions. If there's one figure I would want to leave you all with, it would be the Sarah Vaughan of the Black Freedom Movement in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And her blessed name was Ella Baker. You see, Ella Baker. Read Barbara Ransby's book on Ella Baker. She was one of the founders of King's Movement, the founder of SNCC, part of the Puerto Rican struggle for independence, part of the trade union movement, concerned about fighting homophobia. And here she was, 72 years old, come out of Harlem Black Church. Ella Baker, how did you do it? I listened to Curtis Mayfield. I just kept on pushing. I just kept on pushing. I know it's getting late. You all take good care. Thanks so much. I'm sorry we got to go. I know we got to go.